Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Game Week 11 FPL team selection. This week, obviously, with my transfer plans, I had a very simple standard move that I could make ahead of the curve. It was an early transfer and it was a transfer that I decided to do. So there is no surprise really in terms of my immediate transfers for Game Week 11. But I think just talking about, planning ahead, what my team is really going to look like in the future, I do think that my plans will actually be based on whether I'm going to be fully invested into free hit 18. If you actually haven't watched my video on free hit 18 and why you should sort of plan around that potential strategy, do check the exclamation mark in the box above. That should indicate a video that explains my thoughts and feelings as to why I might be sort of following down a path of Man City and Brentford related transfers, because I could be, for example, planning for a free hit 18. And that's sort of my early thoughts. Now, as far as, let's say, players from these two teams that I'd like to invest into as soon as possible, it would be obviously Mbumo as soon as game week 13/14, Alvarez also on 13/14, maybe in 15 if we can extend that long. Guardiola as well on game week 13 potentially could be a good transfer away from Cash, who starts to have poor fixtures after the Fulham at home fixture in game week 12. Ultimately, it's a good opportunity to also invest into, for example, Flecken ahead of the curve before the blank game week in 18, where he has around 3 fixtures in a row where he's basically going to be a better keeper on paper than Areola, which I quite like. And that is my thoughts in terms of transfer plans. Now, because my transfer this week doesn't actually sort of force me towards the direction of free hit 18, I'm not really concerned, right? We can wait for the news about the double game week on 20 and whether that gets announced, anytime soon. And ultimately, I think, as I said, in the short term, my move as to, let's say, go for Mbumo in the near future away from Diaby is something that I think will be absolutely set in stone on game week 13, maybe 14. On top of that, as I said, I can either go Alvarez or Darwin on game week 14 as well. That's something as well that's on my mind. And moving out of Cash into another defender on game week 12 or game week 13 could be interesting. Probably not game week 12, because game week 12, as I said, is a great Fulham fixture. Ultimately, it's probably a case where I go out of Pedro Porro instead if I want to go out for another defender on game week 12. It really just depends on whether Gabriel can actually be of use to me and hopefully not be rotated for that Burnley fixture. So that's something that I'm generally quite concerned about because of that rotation in the nice fixture for Gabriel. Clearly, it was a case where Mikel saw an opportunity to sort of give Gabriel a bit of rest, but he also played in the EFL Cup fixture where they lost versus West Ham 3-1, and that's quite concerning in terms of, that next opportunity to rest him, which could be that Burnley fixture. So not overly concerned about Gabriel, but he might be a problem sooner than later, so one to think about in terms of making sure that I have a transfer in mind to address that. Before we actually get into my team selection, I'd also like to please shout out for people to subscribe to the channel. Around 50% of my viewers, unfortunately, are not subscribed to the videos. If you guys do enjoy the content and you do enjoy the advice that I give in FPL, I would really appreciate your support through a subscription. Anything can help in terms of a like as well, or even clicking the notification bell. So thank you guys so much for your support so far. So let's actually head on towards our Game Week 11 team selection. It's a very simple week where I think a lot of managers are actually thinking to roll their free transfers, just because either you've wildcard on Game Week 10 or you've made a lot of transfers, let's say saving up 2 free transfers for Game Week 10 last week and you executed them. And right now, because a lot of fixtures are poor and you don't really want to be investing into a Man United team that honestly look worse and worse each week and continue to put out terrible performances, our expectations for them continue to drop. There isn't really a reason, for example, to jump onto that United fixture, even though it's good on paper. So why not just persist, for example, with our Spurs assets, with our Arsenal assets, or even our Liverpool assets, right? In the meantime, for example, I have someone like Gordon, who I don't think I'll be touching this week, even though it's a bad fixture on paper. As far as my defense, as I said, I will be playing Areola. I think it's a toss-up here between, let's say, Turner, who could really lose his position after the one mishap once again. This isn't the first time he's made mistakes this season, but you could also argue there might be a reason in training that has sort of precluded Black Moss from actually coming onto the pitch and being the starting keeper ahead of Turner. I will play Areola instead. I just think he's been a fantastic shot stopper, despite my sort of opinions on West Ham as a team so far. I do think that they've been underperforming. Not underperforming in terms of their outcomes so far. In fact, I think they've been rather fortunate in terms of some of the wins that they've actually received early on this season and just how the results have fallen. the Everton result, it's sort of a sign of what West Ham is more representative of, in my opinion, from the underlying stats. They're not exactly a great defense so far. The team that we usually expect from Moyes to be quite robust in defense is not something that we've seen, at least. As far as offense, I do think that they've been rather dismal. However, of course, the EFL Cup result is going to be something that's, thoroughly in our minds, although that was very clearly also pretty much an Arsenal B team, if we can be honest. So I don't think we should really change our minds on them. They're clearly quite a weak defense, but Nottingham Forest equally are. And Aston Villa being a much stronger attack, in my opinion, than Brentford is something to consider. I also think Areola is just a better shot stopper than Turner. So hopefully, in a situation where I don't see clean sheets for either keeper, Areola's save points can continue to do good for us. For example, last week in a week where Pickford got a clean sheet versus Areola himself, the gulf was only 2 points gap, which is something that I'm not going to complain about given the fact that I invested into this keeper at 4.2 million. As far as Tsimikas, I think he's just a steal. So early in the week, I made that move, Lamptey to Tsimikas, which obviously I've benefited from in the sense that I now have a very, very strong team still on paper for Game Week 11. And that's because Tsimikas is coming to fill in where I have players on the bench instead, like Gabriel and Colwill, who I certainly do not want to be playing this fixture. Even though last season, of course, we saw some Newcastle games where I think Arsenal performed well, kept clean sheets, for example. But my expectations in those games are Newcastle, in my opinion, have also leveled up as an attack. So not exactly fond of, let's say, playing Gabriel. I do think he'll actually keep his position in the team, but also, for example, when we move ahead towards someone like Colwill, as I said, he's sort of a placeholder for Game Week 16. Not really going to be touching him. Tsimikas is a gift. I'm going to take that gift, and I will invest from Lamptey to Tsimikas as a result. Porro is someone that I do like to play. As I said, I think Chelsea over the season have been underperforming, but contrast to, for example, West Ham, they're a team that actually have not gotten results so far, so they've been underperforming in terms of the simple fact that they've just been very, very poor in terms of finishing. West Ham, I would say, have been underperforming, for example, just because we probably have slightly better expectations for them, given their heroics last season as well with the cup win. But they've been very, very poor. Whereas, by contrast, this Chelsea team have definitely stepped up as the level of defense, which maybe doesn't necessarily bode well for Son, but they are now finally away from home, which obviously has huge impacts in terms of how much we can expect in this Tottenham attack that were rather toothless in the first half versus Crystal Palace away. On top of that, too, I think Pedro Porro, you could argue that eventually he'll be due, but the fixtures are getting worse and worse, and I do think very, very shortly we'll be closing in on an opportunity to maybe move Pedro Porro out of my team. He could also be someone who I keep for the short term because maybe cash is a priority transfer out, because his fixtures also start to decline, and it's a case of who I want to bring out first. As I said, cash is someone who has good fixtures up until Game Week 12, and I will be playing him as such for that. And the same sort of logic there sits with my midfield as well in a player like Diaby. The question sort of was raised in my mind as to whether I wanted to go Diaby to Mbumo. I do think it's a very short-termist move, and given that I had a good opportunity to catch upside in terms of moving Lamptey to Tsimikas, even though that sort of forces me into a very precarious position of having 0.0 in the bank, this is something that I don't mind so much, just because I have a team full of 15 players, and there are so many players within all positions that I can downgrade from with one free transfer. And by rolling, hopefully in Game Week 12, I don't really have any moves forced in my team. I have a relatively strong team with one good bench player, hopefully next week if Gabriel plays, and that should put me in a very, very good position. So Diaby is someone that I plan to keep at least until Game Week 13, which is basically very similar to cash, an opportunity to just move out of those Villa assets and maybe just keep Watkins until Game Week 14. As far as, let's say, Salah, Son, Saka, these are players that I think are just going to be permanently sitting in my team unless injuries are forced, or, for example, by the time the AFCON comes around, or by the time the Asian Cup comes around Game Week 21 and Game Week 22, that's going to be where Salah and Son both will not be a part of the Premier League, and they will miss out those two fixtures. Very likely they'll miss out at least one of them, and in that sort of circumstance, I will have to transfer one of them out, most likely, right? Because my bench probably can't afford playing an outfield team with, let's say, I don't know, 30 million in the bank on the bench. So that's going to be an opportunity for me to transfer those players out then, and to sort of unfortunately maybe lose some of the team value that we've built over time with Salah and Son. However, most of the field will also transfer them out, so I don't really have too many worries about the sort of bank value lost in the future. As far as Gordon, I have chosen to play him ahead of some of the other bench defenders that I've been talking about. I also have Archer on the bench. The simple reason why I haven't played Archer over Gordon, and I might obviously, reconsider my decision, but it's the fact that he was benched last week, and overall his minutes have sort of showed a steady decline, right? The benching is just another sort of new sort of part of what seems to be a worsening of our expectations for Cameron Archer. I mean, he's played 31 minutes, 90, 78, 78, and obviously started the season with 74, 90, and 90. So look, the minutes are getting slightly worse. We are starting to see him come off the bench. It might be the case that for whatever reason, Sheffield United felt that he could come off the bench with Arsenal and have a little bit more impact, but it wasn't the case. They were extremely toothless before he even came onto the field. Sheffield United amassed something like 0.03 XG, which just shows you the gulf in quality between a team like Arsenal that are defensive juggernauts in the Premier League, and in the context of most of the teams in the top half anyways, versus a team like Sheffield United who are very, very clearly the worst team in the league. And ultimately, I think, for example, my expectations, my understanding of Wolves as a team is that they have improved, even though they've lost their best player in Neto. So from a defensive point of view, I can't see obviously what Neto brings to the table. And so I have some confidence in Wolves, and I don't have that confidence in Sheffield United. I have a lot of confidence in Gordon in terms of his minutes, because fortunately with the EFL Cup fixture, with them sort of absolutely destroying United and him getting an early substitution at 64 minutes, it probably means that he's actually penciled in for a start versus Arsenal. So that's a good opportunity for me to sort of look at, why not play Gordon, who could once again play another 90 minutes versus this Arsenal team, as long as things go to plan for this Newcastle team. And it's very clear that he is a first choice player. Plus, the injuries that Newcastle currently have mean that his minutes should be guaranteed for the most part, unless, of course, he's having an absolute stinker of a game and you suddenly see Joe Linton and Willock, both sort of share responsibilities on that left-hand side and in the central midfield spot, and even the false nine position. So that's sort of my thoughts. I do think Gordon makes sense. I have much more confidence in him starting, and ultimately more confidence in Newcastle as a team as well. So even though, yes, of course, I'm pitting, for example, let's say Saka and Gordon together, I don't really mind, for example, situations where I'm playing an attacker versus an attacker. And then in terms of the forward positions this week, I will be playing Watkins and Haaland. Haaland, of course, is going to be a captaincy shout for many people who own Haaland. I don't think it's a 50-50 this week between Salah and Haaland. I do think it's more 55 Haaland, 45 Salah. That's why I don't really want to speak too much about captaincy. I think personally, of course, if you're on a no Haaland team, it's very clearly a Salah captaincy. If you're on a Haaland team, to me, it's still very clearly a Haaland captaincy. It's a case of home versus away. It's a case of one player being rested versus one player starting midweek. And it's also a case of Bournemouth being the second worst team in terms of expected goals conceded versus a Luton team that, of course, have been terrible from defense, but still actually slightly better than this Bournemouth team so far as things stand. And they're also at home. So that's going to add into the factor and the weightage as to why I think Haaland is very clearly going to be my captaincy contender for this week. And those are my thoughts. Watkins, of course, is someone who I think we can keep for a long time in terms of keeping him until game week 14. But as I said, because of my thoughts and my preference to maybe play a free hit 18 strategy, he might be on the outs very, very shortly for someone like Alvarez, who I think is still tremendous value if you get to discount the blank. And discount the blank I will if I go for a free hit. And as I said, with the bench this week, I will be going with Turner, Gabriel, Archer, and Colwill in that order. I do think that there are circumstances where it might be the case that it could be a low-scoring game. We've seen in big fixtures this season that Arsenal have been able to shut out key sides. United, Man City being one of them. So ultimately, I do have quite a bit of confidence in this Arsenal team. Zero confidence in Chelsea, unfortunately, keeping a clean sheet for Spurs. Not zero, of course, probably around 10-15%. It could happen, but very, very unlikely for me. And unfortunately, because of my sort of declining appetite for Archer as a pick and his lack of minutes so far, he's going to be second on my bench. And the way I see it too with someone like Archer is if you're wildcarding in the future, I mean, why even bother spending that sort of money on Archer at 4.5? You're better off with someone like Mubama at 4.3. And ultimately, it also speaks towards whether we can actually go 3-4-3 in the future. We don't have to care so much about Archer versus Chukwuemeka. Ultimately, you're just trying to save as much money as possible. So why not try do so? We also have keepers soon enough. If, let's say, Turner loses his position, where you can definitely go for them in the 3.8, 3.9 positions. And, of course, in future wildcards, we might be able to squeeze insane value out of our teams. But keep in mind, of course, we also have to be planning for bench boosts later in the second half of the season, although that's talk for much later down the line in FPL. What I will say is thank you guys so much for watching the videos and supporting the videos so far. I've seen tremendous growth in the channel this season. I've really, really appreciated. I hope you guys can continue to support me, and that would be really by subscribing and also dropping a like on each video, even commenting for the algorithm purposes. And also, once again, thank you to all the members who continue to support the channel. From a financial point of view. Thank you guys so much, each and every one of you, and roll the Hall of Fame.